From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and coming up today, K-State's Glynn Tonsor on the cattle markets. And as part of his visit, he'll offer some thoughts on the numbers often cited on beef producer market share, which he says can be misleading if not carefully considered. Also, a featured speaker at K-State's Beef Stocker Field Day last week from West Texas A&M University, John Richeson, talks about a new approach to receiving rations for shipped-in calves based on high-energy feedstuffs in lieu of strictly a forage-based ration. And K-State's Mike Day will preview the Animal Sciences and Industry Family and Friends Reunion coming up next week, with pre-registrations due in tomorrow. That's what's ahead on this Agriculture Today. Thanks for tuning in once again for Agriculture Today. To the cattle markets we go now as we welcome in livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, K-State Research and Extension, for some remarks on a fed cattle trade that just can't get going. And it did finish roughly steady last week.
Yeah, there's a mixed bag basically across the cattle complex this past week. So let's do fed cattle first, as you said. So AMS called cash market, 5 market on Friday at 123. That's steady, actually a little closer to $1 lower on the week. You look over the board, the nearby October contract was about 120, down $2 for the week. Flip this over to round it out before we go elsewhere on feeder cattle. AMS called the Pratt market steady, but when you break it down by weight class, it was very much a mixed bag. There were certain weight classes were up $3, a couple even $4, and then similarly a couple that were down $2 or $3. I wrote down 2 lots here. The heavier lot was 146 head at 816 pounds, came in at 153. The biggest lot of lighter weight animals was 84 head at 659, actually only sold for 148. I noted that here because it was a very light trade. I think in the weeks ahead, we're going to have a lot more calves trade there, so don't overreact to that. But that was the biggest lot of quote-unquote calves. On the board, October feeder cattle, 153, down $4.50 for the week. So either down or flat, depending on which those numbers you want to highlight. When you add into here what was going on the wholesale meat side, you'll pick up on part of the reason I think we had this, at least some downward pressure this past week. So choice is down $10, so $293 on Friday versus $303 the Friday before. And then select was also down right at about $10, $265 versus $275 the Friday before. I think there's several reasons for that, but there's certainly growing commentary on has economic growth either stalled or slowed strongly. There's uncertainty on that. More and more discussion about the debt ceiling. We have some, I was going to say local, but it's really, when I mean local, I mean within the country, not global, issues about whether or not we're going to expand the debt ceiling and the like. A little more narrow tactical observations. The restaurant performance index hit a 6-month low in August. So if you remember, we were, let's say roughly April, lots of anxious discussion, more and more foot traffic warming up. People are excited to go to restaurants, and the Delta variant and other things happen. So some of that spilled over. There's growing concern on the restaurant side of demand is the point of that. And then more generally across all consumers, the Consumer Sentiment Index, which is maintained at the University of Michigan, this past 3 months in a row has been lower than it was looking back to April. And again, I think some of that is the narrative on inflation is changing a little bit. Some have thought it might be transitory. Hopefully our listeners know I've been concerned it would be transitory. And I think it's persisted for a while, and I think consumers are starting to take note of that. Even things, I was on Twitter this morning talking about looking ahead to the Christmas season. There's more and more discussion about you might have to plan months ahead in order to get the items you want. And then you look at the price. It all boils down to supply chain challenges, labor challenges and supplies and issues at the port and the like. Put a bow around what I'm throwing at everybody here is there's growing commentary on is macroeconomic activity slowing? Is the fourth quarter going to be slower than we hoped? And maybe inflation higher as we go? Economists call some of that stagflation. That's not necessarily a fun thing to live through, and I think that's put some pressure on the market this past week.
Well, the broader economy right now is in the balance, so this is obviously weighing heavily on the market.
It is, and I'm not a macroeconomist, but I do feel compelled to remind everybody the average U.S. consumer does have a lot of cash. So one of the aftermaths of the massive federal stimulus in the last 18 months is personal cash balances for the quote-unquote average. I know we're a big country. There's a lot of variation around that, but there's a lot of cash in households. That gives a lot of staying power. There's a shock absorber, if you like, in personal finances, and that is important. But nonetheless, we need to monitor the situation.
And on something that you think bears discussion, and that is the often cited farmer's share or producer's share of the food dollar and how that should be interpreted. And the gist of it here, and you might explain further, is that sometimes that's misread.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is the term farmer's share of the retail dollar is brought up pretty often. In the last couple months in particular, it's in the general media and lots of commentary around it. And at the same time, I don't want the industry collectively, and I'm not picking seed stock or feedlot or any sector when I say that, but the industry collectively to do anything that's self-defeating. And these are words of caution is where they're coming from, because that statistic can easily be misused. And I'm not the first economist to give this warning. There's 3 either current or former Montana State ag economists published a paper back in 2009. And literally, I'm going to read a quote here because I think it's important, is the lack of informational content in the share of the retail dollar farm statistic suggests these data should not be used for policy purposes. If you read that full paper, they comment on exactly how it's derived and its lack of a relationship with farmers' profitability is where that comment's coming from. And they also cite work that goes all the way back to 1956. And if I would have done even more homework, I'd probably find stuff before that. But the point is, it's a multiple decade long. This is a political issue that comes in waves over time. And today, I think there's even more concerns about using that statistic sitting here in 2021 than there used to be. By definition, retail dollar, I mean, that's like the definition of it is at the retail store. Well, something that's developed since my predecessors is we now have 3 market channels. So food service as well as export and retail. So even taking a piece of 1/3 of that isn't the whole story. Just start right there is one of my concerns. The second part would be there's some well-known biases in certain of those price series. And I don't mean bias in the sense that somebody's trying to cook the books. Don't misinterpret what I mean by that. But if you don't account for buy one, get one free, and we call that featuring activity and so forth at the grocery store, then you have a price series that's posted at a higher level than consumers are actually paying. If you keep going with this, even picking a spot negotiated fed cattle price versus comprehensive, or the same thing on box beef or the like, those selections of what price series and variables you use to derive these statistics can notably change your conclusions. And then finally on my list here is there's been a lot of post and pre-farm gate changes. So lots of improvement in genetics, feed management, and the like that is pre-farm gate, so still during the live animal segment of our system. And then a lot of stuff that's post-farm gate, think deboning, adding flavoring, adding convenience, demand enhancement, merchandising efforts and the like. Well, the balance of all those things is good for the industry. I would argue they are demand enhancing and or adding cost efficiencies to the system. That's great. That's why we've done it over time. But we need to recognize they don't happen in equal proportions pre and post farm gate or pre and post wholesale and retail and the like. So they're going to have natural consequences on a share of any statistic, right? In this case, farmer share of the retail dollars, what we're talking about. And we need to be aware of that. So you can certainly have a declining share, even if one deals with all the measurement concerns I've noted, and it still be rational because some of the investments in the industry were at a different stage. Put a bow around that, Eric. I just see a notable increase in interest in the statistic. And I encourage those that are, either a producer just thinking about it, somebody that's a media writing about it, a policymaker think about taking action, please take note of all those.
And in the meantime, it sounds like a makeover in the approach to measure that is in order here on the part of some enterprising agricultural economists.
I would encourage some of that. And on that note, actually, Ted Schroeder, myself, Lee Schultz, and some others, there is a piece on our Ag Manager website. If somebody wants to reach out to me, I'll get a link of that to them. We have given some suggestions in the past to USDA. And to USDA's credit, they are trying to improve it as well.
Yeah. Always a pleasure. Thanks, Glynn.
Thank you, Eric.
On the cattle markets, Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist, K-State Research and Extension. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Among the invited speakers at K-State's 2021 Beef Stocker Field Day this past Thursday was an accomplished animal scientist out of West Texas A&M University, and he reported on what was being billed as a novel approach to starting newly arrived calves on feed. By the sound of it, this is an idea that has great potential. John Richeson is the Paul Engler Professor of Beef Cattle Feedlot Management at West Texas A&M, and he's well acquainted with some of the nutritional adjustment issues that can arise when bringing stockers in for backgrounding. His work has been addressing such challenges.
Specifically, the high-risk animal, those cattle typically come in stressed, transported, and in a negative energy balance because they haven't consumed both water and feed properly for several days through the marketing process. So that kind of sets up a dilemma how we manage the nutrition of those newly received calves. The dogma in the past has been always to provide a lot of roughage and a ration, a receiving ration, very high in roughage. And there's certainly some wisdom behind that. But we're looking at different ways and different techniques and different types of rations to provide to those cattle that may be a better alternative. And in a nutshell, that would be providing a much higher energy ration. We have this paradox with these cattle that, you know, we want them to come to the bunk and consume feed and roughage, and really does a good job of that. But yet you dilute out the energy of the ration if you're using a really high roughage ration typically. And so some research that we did with a very high energy ration that we fed to high-risk calves, hopefully, you know, correct that negative energy balance quicker after arrival.
Well, then, right to it, what are the components of that higher energy ration? What feedstuffs are you turning to in lieu of heavy emphasis on forage?
Yeah, so our facility at West Texas A&M University, it's a research feedlot, but it would translate very well to a typical stocker receiving facility, a dry lot stocker receiving facility. But we have two standard rations that we use at our feedlot, a receiving ration that's a typical higher roughage ration, and then, of course, we have a finisher ration that we use to finish the cattle. What we wanted to look at is, can we start these high-risk cattle that come in a negative energy balance, they don't consume feed very well for a couple weeks, can we start those cattle on our higher energy finishing ration right off the bat? And, you know, with the goal of correcting that energy balance, but also perhaps we don't deal with the acidosis and the digestive issues in those cattle because they essentially self-limit their intake for a couple weeks after arrival while on that ration. And, of course, we compared that to the traditional standard operating procedure of our higher roughage ration and two different treatment groups that we evaluated.
You mentioned that these high-stress calves tend to self-limit on that intake. Is that because of they're not accustomed to the palatability of that particular feedstuff? What's at work there?
That's certainly one factor, but there's a number of things that are occurring in those cattle. One, yes, certainly would be that they're in an unfamiliar environment. They're offered a feedstuff that's probably pretty unfamiliar to them. But through that marketing process, they're undergoing a lot of inflammation and perhaps infection with virus or bacteria involved in bovine respiratory disease. And so inflammation certainly causes anorexia or a lack of appetite in those cattle. So it's a combination of a number of things that cause the very low intake for several weeks after arrival.
Right to the nib of the gist. So far, are you finding that these high-stressed calves are responding well to the higher energy ration?
We do have some preliminary data, and essentially what we found is the cattle receiving the typical higher roughage receiving diet actually consumed a little more feed early and gained a little bit better very early the first couple weeks from arrival. A lot of that is probably fill differences. They're filling their gut fill faster with that higher roughage diet, and that translates to weight that quickly after arrival. But after the first couple weeks, the dry matter intake kind of equilibrates between the two rations that we evaluated, and the cattle on the higher energy finisher ration, if you will, gained more, the other cattle, and they gained much, much more efficiently. And so that translated into a much better feed cost of gain and just overall cost of gain during the receiving period.
So positive results. Any downsides to that program that you've run across?
The downside is you've got to be a good manager and pay close attention to those cattle because, as I mentioned earlier, obviously acidosis is a concern. We did not see any acidosis in this trial. We had our typical respiratory disease outbreak, but I say that, and it can be very difficult to differentiate BRD from acidosis, but just anecdotally, it appears that because they came in and did not consume a lot of feed early, that helped those cattle on that really higher energy ration transition the rumen to that higher energy, more starch ration over time gradually. And I think it worked out nicely, and we did not have major digestive issues in this study.
That's a cattle feedlot management scientist out of West Texas A&M University, Canyon, Texas, John Richeson. Information from his calf receiving ration trials, as reported at K-State's Beef Stocker Field Day last week. We'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today is back now. If you didn't notice, and quite possibly you didn't, this broadcast has undergone a fairly subtle format change. From here on, we'll be coming to you around a half hour each weekday. Our final segment on the Monday edition will feature a look ahead to the week's K-State Agriculture events calendar. We'll be offering you a rundown of what K-State Research and Extension has coming up for you here in Manhattan or elsewhere around the state. What we'll spotlight today is an event that happens to be here on the campus, and it is a week from this Friday, October the 15th. However, pre-registrations are due in tomorrow. It's the 7th Annual K-State Animal Sciences and Industry Family and Friends Reunion at the Stanley Stout Center. If you've been to this gathering before, you'll know what a great occasion it is. Here's more on it from the head of the Animal Sciences and Industry Department, Mike Day.
It's a huge event it even extends beyond alums to our stakeholders out across the state, and even many from across the nation will come in to enjoy this event. So they get to meet our students, get to meet the faculty, and really just have a night of fellowship and sharing.
And a centerpiece of this event is the awarding of the Don Good Impact Award. Tell us about the recipient this year.
So the recipient of the Don Good Impact Award this year is U.S. Premium Beef, which has been a tremendous organization for our cattle producers in Kansas, and a well-deserved award for U.S. Premium Beef.
It's, of course, offered in the memory of Don Good, longtime Animal Science Department head at Kansas State. As far as the festivities go, lots of food, lots of fellowship. Other things that you consider highlights?
Well, we have the children's barnyard, which is always great for the kids, so we want folks to bring their kids on. They can spend time in the barnyard. There's some gifts for them at the end, and really just to help those young people understand the tradition of Kansas State and the Animal Sciences and Industry Department. Marching band will be up, as is tradition, and 350 strong. They'll play a set of songs, and you'll get a chance to enjoy that, and then we feed them. The food is beef, pork, chicken that's prepared, catered here, an excellent meal for all.
It's in person this year. Why, last year was a bit complicated and it didn't come off, but this year it will be the full festivities at the Stanley Stout Center. How does one take part? Registrations are being accepted right now, aren't they?
Yeah, registrations are open until the middle of next week, at least pre-registration, but if you don't get registered, you can register at the door. You'll see a couple of changes. We'll register you outside as you come into the building, and some of our festivities are shifted out into the tents that we put up around Stanley Stout. But as always, the Stout Center will be open on both ends to accommodate the people and the fun that we have during that evening.
K-State's Mike Day on the 2021 K-State Animal Sciences and Industry Family and Friends Reunion, Friday, October the 15th, Stanley Stout Center. The pre-registration deadline, again Tuesday, October the 5th, that is tomorrow. You can register online at asi.ksu.edu/family and friends, all one word there. asi.ksu.edu/family and friends. You can also call Lois Schreiner at the department, and she'll take care of this for you. 785-532-1267. Again, Lois at 785-532-1267. It's simply a terrific get-together. We hope to see you there. Previewing tomorrow's broadcast, we plan to have in from the College of Veterinary Medicine here at K-State, Steve Inslee and Bob Larson. They'll tell us more about this new veterinary toxicology training and outreach program out of K-State that's expected to be a great step forward for livestock veterinary services across the state. We'll cover that and more for you tomorrow right here. Meantime, thanks for tuning in today. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.